You didn't notice it at first. That small shift in tone, that silence where warmth used to be, that absence of emotional availability you once took for granted. You assumed it was temporary. But what you didn't understand is this: an empath doesn't react like most people. They don't fight for attention. They don't compete for presence. They study patterns. And when they realize they are being consistently ignored, something subtle but irreversible happens. They stop trying to be seen. Not because they stopped caring instantly, but because their mind starts building a new internal rule. If I am not valued here, I will conserve myself elsewhere. This is where most people miscalculate. They think silence means patience. They think distance means insecurity. They think absence means confusion. But in an empath, silence is data processing. Distance is emotional restructuring. Absence is finalizing detachment. And once that process completes, you don't get dramatic revenge. You get something far more permanent. You get irrelevance. Because the empath you ignored doesn't break loudly. They don't announce their pain. They don't ask for closure 10 times. They quietly downgrade your importance in their emotional system until you no longer trigger response. And here's the part most people only understand when it's too late. You don't lose an empath in one moment. You lose them in a series of ignored messages, dismissed feelings, and unnoticed withdrawals. By the time you realize the shift, they are no longer emotionally reachable. They can still smile at you. They can still speak politely. They can still exist in your space. But the connection you once had, it has already been archived and sealed. So when the title says, "You ignored the wrong empath," the consequences begin. Understand this. The consequence is not what they do to you. It's what they stop doing for you. And in emotional psychology, that is the most irreversible outcome of all. When an empath is ignored, dismissed, or emotionally overlooked, the impact does not show immediately in a loud or dramatic way. Instead, it unfolds internally through a gradual psychological and emotional recalibration that is deeply rooted in pattern recognition and emotional intelligence. At first, the empath tries to understand the situation rather than react to it. They observe tone changes, response delays, lack of effort, and emotional inconsistency, and they attempt to make sense of it through patience and empathy rather than confrontation. However, this patience is not unlimited. It is an active process of collecting emotional data. Every ignored message, every dismissed feeling, and every unreturned effort becomes a data point that the empath stores subconsciously. Unlike impulsive individuals who react outwardly, the empath processes inwardly, meaning their emotional system begins to adjust without announcing it. Over time, this creates a psychological shift where the empath starts to detach not because of anger, but because of clarity. They begin to understand that emotional investment without mutual acknowledgement leads to imbalance, and their mind naturally moves towards self-preservation. This is where the real transformation begins. The empath stops seeking validation from the same source that repeatedly fails to provide it. Instead of chasing attention, they start redirecting their emotional energy inward or toward environments where reciprocity exists. What most people misunderstand is that this withdrawal is not sudden. It is the final stage of a long internal negotiation where the empath has already tried multiple times emotionally before deciding to step back. The silence that follows is not confusion or sadness, it is conclusion. At this point, the empath's emotional system has already reclassified the person who ignored them from safe emotional connection to unreliable emotional source, and once that classification is made, it is extremely difficult to reverse. Even if the other person later attempts to reconnect, the empath no longer responds with the same depth because the emotional pathway that once carried attachment has been weakened through repeated neglect. This is why the consequences of ignoring an empath are not external or dramatic, but internal and irreversible. The empath does not seek revenge or confrontation. They simply lose emotional availability. They may still interact socially, but the emotional bond that once made them open, expressive, and deeply connected is no longer accessible. In psychological terms, this is a form of emotional disengagement, where the brain reduces attachment signals due to lack of reinforcement. The most critical misunderstanding is that people often think they can restore the connection with time or apologies. But in reality, once an empath reaches this stage of detachment, the emotional cost of reconnecting outweighs the emotional benefit. As a result, the empath chooses peace over confusion, stability over inconsistency, and self-respect over repeated emotional uncertainty. This is the silent consequence, not retaliation, not conflict, but permanent emotional withdrawal that happens so subtly that the other person only realizes it when the connection they once relied on is no longer there. When an empath experiences being ignored, the process does not trigger immediate outward reaction, but instead activates a deep internal evaluation system that is highly sensitive to emotional inconsistency and relational imbalance. In the beginning stage, the empath does not assume rejection. Instead, they try to interpret the behavior through understanding, giving space for possible explanations such as stress, distraction, or temporary distance. This is because empaths are naturally wired to seek meaning before judgment, and they often prioritize emotional context over emotional reaction. However, during this phase, they are not passive. They are quietly observing patterns. Every delayed response, every ignored message, every moment of emotional absence is being stored as evidence in their internal awareness. Unlike most individuals who react based on single incidents, the empath evaluates continuity. They are not asking, "What happened today?" but rather, "What has been happening consistently?" This subtle shift in questioning is where the psychological transformation begins. Over time, repeated emotional neglect starts to create cognitive dissonance in the empath's mind, where their effort and emotional investment no longer align with the response they receive. This imbalance does not immediately lead to confrontation. Instead, it leads to emotional fatigue. The empath begins to unconsciously reduce their emotional output as a protective mechanism, not out of anger, but out of self-regulation. This is the first visible sign of withdrawal, although it is still subtle and often unnoticed by the other person. As the process continues, the empath reaches a deeper stage of emotional restructuring where attachment begins to weaken naturally without external force. At this point, they no longer seek explanation or validation because their mind has already processed the pattern and reached a conclusion about the reliability of the emotional connection. The key psychological shift here is that the empath stops investing energy into uncertainty. Instead of trying harder to be seen or understood, they begin redirecting their emotional focus inward, strengthening their independence and restoring their emotional balance. This is not a reactionary decision, but a progressive adaptation that happens through accumulated experiences of being ignored. Once this stage is reached, the empath's behavior changes significantly. They become quieter, more observant, and emotionally self-contained. They may still respond, but the emotional depth behind their responses is reduced because the internal attachment system has already downgraded the connection. What most people fail to realize is that this stage is not reversible through sudden attention or apology, because the empath is no longer operating from emotional dependence, but from emotional awareness. The consequence of ignoring an empath, therefore, is not visible conflict, but emotional absence. The person who once gave depth, care, and understanding is still physically present, but emotionally no longer accessible. This creates a permanent shift where the empath chooses stability over inconsistency and self-respect over repeated emotional confusion. In essence, the connection does not end in drama. It ends in quiet detachment, where the empath simply stops offering emotional access to someone who repeatedly proved unworthy of it. When an empath is ignored, the first psychological response is not anger or confrontation, but heightened internal awareness, where they begin to observe emotional patterns with increased sensitivity and depth. In this initial stage, the empath does not immediately assume rejection. Instead, they attempt to understand the inconsistency in behavior by analyzing context, timing, and emotional tone. They are naturally inclined to give space and assume positive intent, so they often excuse early signs of neglect as temporary distraction or external pressure. However, beneath this patience, their mind is actively recording every interaction. Each delayed reply, each moment of emotional absence, and each instance of feeling unseen is stored as subtle emotional data. Unlike reactive personalities who respond to individual events, the empath processes patterns over time, meaning they are less affected by one isolated incident, but deeply affected by repetition. This continuous observation slowly creates an internal comparison between emotional effort and emotional return. When the imbalance becomes consistent, cognitive dissonance begins to form where the empath feels the mismatch between what they give and what they receive. At this point, they do not yet withdraw, but they begin to reduce emotional intensity slightly as a self-protective response. This reduction is not intentional punishment toward the other person. Rather, it is an unconscious regulation of emotional energy to prevent further internal exhaustion. This stage is often unnoticed externally, but internally, it marks the beginning of emotional distancing. As time progresses, the empath moves into a phase of emotional reassessment, where the accumulated pattern of neglect becomes too consistent to ignore, forcing their mind to accept reality rather than interpret possibilities. This is where the empath begins to detach mentally before detaching physically. They stop overanalyzing the reasons behind the behavior and instead focus on the outcome of the behavior itself. The shift is significant because it marks the transition from emotional hope to emotional clarity. In this phase, the empath starts prioritizing self-respect over emotional uncertainty, and their attention naturally shifts away from the source of inconsistency. They no longer seek validation or reassurance as frequently, and their emotional availability becomes selective. The connection that once felt open and deeply engaging begins to feel restrained, not because the empath is deliberately shutting down, but because their emotional system is recalibrating to avoid repeated disappointment. This recalibration is a defense mechanism built on experience, where the brain learns that continued investment without reciprocity leads to emotional depletion. As a result, the empath begins to conserve emotional energy for environments or relationships that feel stable, balanced, and mutual. This is the stage where most people begin to notice change, but they often misinterpret it as temporary distance rather than permanent adjustment. In the final stage of this process, the empath reaches full emotional detachment, where the internal connection that once created attachment no longer produces the same emotional response. This does not mean they stop caring overnight. Instead, it means the emotional pathway that once linked them to the person who ignored them has weakened to the point of near disconnection. At this stage, the empath no longer seeks explanation, closure, or emotional repair because their mind has already concluded that the cost of continued emotional exposure is greater than the value of the connection. They may still interact socially or remain polite, but the emotional depth that once defined the relationship is no longer accessible. This is the most misunderstood consequence of ignoring an empath. There is no dramatic exit, no confrontation, and no visible breakdown. Instead, there is quiet removal of emotional access. The empath simply stops offering the version of themselves that once cared deeply, listened fully, and invested consistently. What remains is a calm but distant presence that no longer reacts to emotional inconsistency, because it has already accepted it as a permanent pattern. In psychological terms, this is emotional disengagement through repeated invalidation, where the brain protects itself by reducing attachment signals. Ultimately, the consequence is irreversible, not because the empath chooses revenge, but because they choose emotional stability over repeated uncertainty, leaving the connection intact in appearance, but permanently dissolved in depth. When an empath is ignored, the first stage of response is internal observation rather than external reaction, because their mind is naturally tuned to detect emotional patterns and subtle shifts in behavior. In the beginning, they do not immediately label the situation as rejection. Instead, they try to understand it through context, assuming that there may be external reasons such as stress, busyness, or temporary emotional distance. This is where their depth of perception becomes both a strength and a vulnerability, because they give space where others might demand clarity. However, while they are being patient externally, internally they are already collecting emotional data. Every delayed response, every unacknowledged effort, and every moment of being emotionally overlooked is recorded in their subconscious awareness. Unlike impulsive individuals who react to isolated events, the empath evaluates continuity, meaning they focus on repeated patterns rather than single incidents. This continuous evaluation slowly builds a sense of imbalance between emotional investment and emotional return. At this stage, the empath does not withdraw, but they begin to subtly reduce emotional intensity as a form of self-regulation. This reduction is not conscious punishment or retaliation. It is a natural protective response to prevent emotional exhaustion. This early phase is critical because it is often invisible to the other person, even though it marks the beginning of emotional distancing within the empath's internal world. As the pattern of being ignored continues, the empath enters a phase of emotional comparison and internal conflict, where their mind begins to weigh effort against outcome more consciously. This is where cognitive dissonance becomes stronger, because the empath can clearly feel the difference between what they give and what they receive. They begin questioning not only the behavior of the other person, but also the sustainability of the emotional connection itself. However, instead of reacting emotionally, they process this conflict logically and silently. Their natural tendency to understand rather than confront leads them to reassess the value of continued emotional investment. During this stage, emotional hope starts to weaken, and acceptance of inconsistency begins to replace the expectation of change. As this shift occurs, the empath gradually withdraws their emotional availability. They may still respond and remain present, but the depth behind their responses becomes noticeably reduced. This is not because they are intentionally distancing themselves in a dramatic way, but because their emotional system is recalibrating to protect them from repeated disappointment. The empath begins prioritizing inner stability over external validation, and this shift is often misunderstood by others as temporary silence rather than permanent emotional adjustment. In the next phase, the empath reaches emotional restructuring, where their internal system begins to fully accept that the relationship or connection is not providing balanced emotional exchange. At this point, they stop seeking explanations or trying to decode inconsistent behavior, because their mind has already formed a pattern-based conclusion. This is a crucial psychological turning point because it marks the transition from emotional engagement to emotional independence. The empath begins to redirect their focus inward, investing more energy into personal growth, self-awareness, and environments that feel emotionally safe. Their communication style becomes more selective, and their responses become more controlled and less emotionally driven. What once triggered deep emotional reactions now receives calm acknowledgement or minimal response. This is not emotional coldness, but emotional conservation. The empath is no longer operating from a place of emotional dependency. Instead, they are operating from emotional awareness. At this stage, attempts to suddenly restore connection through attention or apology often fail because the empath's internal trust system has already downgraded the reliability of the emotional bond. The shift is not visible as conflict, but as quiet detachment, which is often more powerful because it happens without confrontation or closure. In the final phase, the empath reaches full emotional disengagement, where the connection still exists externally, but no longer carries emotional depth internally. They may continue to interact in a polite, composed, and even friendly manner, but the emotional attachment that once defined the relationship has significantly diminished or completely dissolved. This is the most misunderstood consequence of ignoring an empath. Because there is no dramatic ending, no argument, and no visible breakdown, instead there is silent withdrawal of emotional access. The empath no longer seeks validation, reassurance, or closeness from the person who repeatedly ignored them because their internal system has already chosen emotional stability over uncertainty. At this stage, the brain has effectively reduced attachment signals due to lack of emotional reinforcement, making the previous depth of connection difficult to restore. Even if the other person realizes their mistake and attempts to reconnect, they often find that the empath is present but no longer reachable in the same emotional way. The consequence is not revenge or retaliation, but permanence and detachment. The empath does not erase the person from life, but they erase emotional dependency from the relationship, leaving behind a version of connection that exists only in structure, not in feeling.